Hey guys, welcome to Ken Michaels Radio. Thanks for tuning in, and thanks to all of you who have subscribed so far to the channel. I've been having so much fun interviewing a lot of people in the Beatle world, and we have a special guest. Everyone I welcome to this channel is a special guest, but this guy is someone who is someone you should not you should definitely be familiar with because of all the work that he's done on the Beatles. He's written a number of Beatle books, including Liddypool, Birthplace of the Beatles, and the Fab 104. He also put out a documentary called Looking for Lennon, and he has a brand new book out which he's got behind me and I've got in front of me. It's called The Country of Liverpool, Nashville of the North. Welcome to Ken Michaels Radio, David Bedford.
Hi, Ken. Good to be with you and good to be able to see you as well.
Yeah,
This is great.
It's been a few years, but hopefully the next fest for Beatle fans.
Let's hope.
Yeah, okay. We have no idea what's about to happen, but we can all dream, can't we?
We certainly can. We certainly can.
So your new book is all about country music in the town of Liverpool and also the impact that country music had on the Beatles.
Yeah.
And we did a previous interview just last week on my other podcast show, Things We Said Today. And you did say that early on, one of the things that you shared in common with your father was that you both love Johnny Cash. Was that the start for you of your interest in country music?
Funny enough, I was watching the Johnny Cash biopic just before. Big fan of his, always have been. So that's probably the first time I came across country music. I think he also had some Hank Williams as well. When I was thinking about this, something, yeah, I'm sure he had Hank Williams as well and a couple of others. And also we then mentioned Tijuana Brass, and we won't go there again.
Hey,
just for you.
Don't knock my Herb Albert. Okay.
It wasn't my thing. But okay. that was pure. That really was the only music my dad and I had in common. Really was listening to Johnny Cash. Now there he was in the 60s, just become a vicar in the Church of England. So the pop and rock world really was not what he was looking to, unless it was Cliff Richard. So it was all very, very new and different and a little bit scary as he was, starting his ministry as a vicar. And so he never really liked or listened to much music outside of gospel music, that little bit of country, and his easy listening, and your Tijuana Brass, etc. as well.
And how did he feel about you loving the Beatles?
Oh, he never had a problem with that at all. I mean, in the 70s, because I wasn't born until 65, so of course all the Beatles recording career, I missed all that. So the Fab Four, really my earliest Fab Four was Status Quo. Great rock band, and still one of my all-time favorites. Seen them more than any other band, got all the records and stuff. So I loved a lot of rock music, but I've always had an interest in such a variety of music. And with going to the school that Ringo had attended, so I started there at the age of 4 in 1969. So it could actually be my fault the Beatles broke up. It's possible.
All right, let's cut this interview. Okay.
So I was always aware, that living by the bottom of the road where Ringo was born, being in Liverpool as a kid, you knew of the Beatles. And I was aware of that. So it was really when I started playing guitar. At first, I was about 8, but the guitar was too big and I was too little. Really started seriously when I was about 12 or 13.
Okay. But you got into the Beatles about what year?
That's it. I cannot remember. It just, I always seem to have known about them because it's a group of friends, and that included some a couple of years younger than me and a few like 2 or 3 years older than me, and we were hanging around. So depending on whose house we were in determined what music we were listening to. So somebody always had Beatles music around, but I learned about Buddy Holly back then, and the Everlys, as well as more contemporary groups like Journey was one of those that we were all into, but a lot of us like Status Quo and other bands. But there was such a variety of music around, and it seems to be the thing with, it's like when I got into looking for the country music thing, it's been the same for in Liverpool. However you discover music, it tends to be in your mate's house. that there's somebody you know who's maybe just that little bit older than you,
Yeah.
who's got this great record collection, and as a group you gravitate to their place. I'm particularly a good mate of mine, Tommy, again lived down in the Dingle, and he had a fantastic record collection. So we'd often aim to be there in his front room listening to records.
Right.
And so I got exposed to so many different styles of music. So I just always seem to remember the Beatles being a part of that music I was listening to.
So you and I share that in common because without my realizing it during my childhood, I was exposed to a lot of different music and nothing was ever forced on me, you know? And
Yeah,
so for me to accept the Beatles doing all the different styles of music they did, it there was no struggle, you know?
yeah,
So they're doing Helter Skelter and Honey Pie on the same album.
yeah,
Uh, it was like breathing out and breathing in for someone like myself. And so I guess you had the same kind of, experience.
yeah. And I still do. I still love discovering new music,
Hmm.
and still discovering old music as
Sure.
well. Because there's so much out there. Whatever style you want, or you hear a name somewhere, you can just look it up and find it so easily.
These days,
Yeah,
absolutely.
because of
Yeah.
course it used to be in the good old days. You know, if you knew a record was coming out by your favorite artist, you waited for that date, made sure you had the money, and you
Mm,
queued up and you went to the record shop and you bought the record. And it was a
yeah.
thing to have, wasn't it?
Oh,
It
yeah.
was a precious thing to have. Now I think, oh, I wonder about them. Download. Yeah, I've got it. It's not quite as exciting.
I know. I know. And also, radio was such a big part of that for me,
Oh
discovering
yeah,
music through the radio.
yeah.
I mean,
Oh, absolutely.
most of my record collection is just that. But was country music a constant for you throughout most of your life from Johnny Cash on?
Oh
And
yeah,
and Hank
yeah. All those groups that I discovered when I was younger, I was still listening to now. You know, I still keep going back to listen to the Chirping Crickets album.
Mm,
I mean, that will always be absolute genius.
right.
It will always be one of my all-time favorite albums. It's brilliant, and I still love listening to Johnny Cash. You know,
Uh-huh.
all the Everly Brothers. You know, Roy Orbison. But I still listen to Status Quo, and obviously listen to the Beatles.
Hmm.
Um, so it varies what mood I'm in, what I'm wanting, and sometimes I just want to reconnect with a certain time in my life, and that could involve the '80s when it was groups like it was the synthesizer groups like Flock
Yep.
of Seagulls,
Sure.
Orchestral Maneuvers in the Dark. Um, and it's that wonderful thing about music, and I find this like when we meet up at Beatle Fest, etc., and talking with fans, you can mention a record, and that song takes you back to a certain time in your life,
Hmm.
and it's one of those unique things that music has that, which I love about the Beatle community as well, is that it doesn't matter what you look like, what the color of your skin is, what
Mm,
country you come from. You know, it's irrelevant. There's this common interest
right.
in this music, and you can tell your life story by songs as to
You're
where you
absolutely
were.
right.
Uh,
Absolutely right. And the thing about the artist that you just mentioned, to me, I can hear a lot of that 80s music and it sounds like it could have come out today, as far as I'm concerned.
yeah, yeah,
And yeah, it does take you back to the memories. And I do feel that the music that you grew up with as you get older has more and more significance, and you realize what an important part it played in shaping your taste in music as well. So
yeah.
yeah, but explain to me, I want to know if this is the same in England, but I'm kind of relating this to jazz because I know a lot of people in the jazz world who study jazz and the history of jazz will take a look at today's jazz and say, that's not real jazz. Is there any kind of similar attitude when it comes to country music in England? Because to some people, real country music is Jimmy Rogers, Hank Williams, the Carter family. Then you have generations later, it could be Johnny Cash or, Dolly Parton, that kind of thing, moving into the 70s, which for me was my favorite musical decade, and I loved a lot of the country crossovers, they call
Yeah,
them over here, like a Charlie Rich or Alabama, that kind of thing. John Denver, which to me he was
yeah,
more pop than country, but a lot of
yeah,
people thought he was country. And then you've got heavyweights like George Strait, um, Garth Brooks, who's like was the
mega.
biggest thing ever.
Yeah.
Was there any kind of prevailing attitude in England as the new country was recorded that it's not real country music? Or, is it
Yeah.
kind of like people stick to the eras that they grew up in?
It's a funny thing. I thought, am I going to try and define country music? And I learned that very quickly. You can't,
Hmm.
because country music is just like this overall banner. Within that, you have so many different subgenres. It's impossible to say that is or that isn't country music. So if you're going back to people like Jimmy Rogers, Hank Williams, and I suppose there's a bit of a theme going right through country music, that the blues is very much part
Hmm.
of country music there. If you're going back to the very beginning, like the Carter family, and those people from particularly the Appalachian Mountains, who were sort of at what you call the really genuine old style country music. Well,
Hmm.
that is coming back from British folk music, and particularly the Celtic music of the Irish and the Scots that was coming over. So there's a lot of history in that style of music.
Hmm.
But it's been a funny thing in this country. I was talking to somebody from one of the country magazines, and I was saying, I've done this book, but I wanted to do more, and I need some help finding more and more UK artists.
Hmm.
And I mentioned a couple. So probably the most successful individual from our area around Merseyside is Charlie Lansbury. He's done so many top-selling albums, recorded in Nashville, played at the Opry. Great guy. And I listed then like the Hillsides and Phil Brady and Hank Walters, the people that I've been writing about.
Hmm.
And the guy said to me, well, to be honest, I don't particularly like Charlie Lansbury. I don't think he's country. The Hillsiders I know of, but I wouldn't have listened to. In fact, there's no real UK country artists ever that I would really consider country.
Hmm.
I thought, okay, so this coming from somebody who writes for a British country magazine, not a great endorsement. And I think that's been one of the biggest problems. And when interviewing like Phil Brady, who's one of the main biography I'm telling in the book, but the problem that he came across, that it was funny when he was on tour in Europe, particularly going around the American Air Force bases. And I was saying, now you're playing to Americans who really love their country music.
Hmm.
How did you go down? And he said, not a problem at all. They absolutely loved us. And so, well, did you sing with an American accent or did you keep your own? Because this was a big thing about what the Beatles and Mersey Beat did, which was
Uh-huh.
playing American rock and roll,
Right.
but doing it in the local accent. And Phil said, oh, no, we definitely would not have tried to do an American accent because that just would have been ridiculous. We wouldn't have got away with that. We
Hmm.
always used our own. And they went down really well. So it seemed to be with the Americans they were performing to had no problem whatsoever. There's some kind of snobbishness within Britain somewhere that thinks country music can only be played and performed by Americans.
Hmm. But it
And
also has to be country music that emanated from your country first, and
if you get into that, then it's saying, okay, so which country are we talking about? Yeah, exactly. And it's stupid. It's one of those problems. You mentioned jazz. It's one of those reasons that jazz tailed off over here. Was a similar attitude in that the only proper jazz was American jazz. Then, of course, there was the ban on jazz musicians coming over here from the mid 30s.
Hmm.
So the only jazz music you could hear were from British jazz groups and artists. And after a while, they sort of run out. So that sort of led to the downfall of jazz, as skiffle sort of kept it going a little bit before rock and roll came in, which is why the cavern had to change, because jazz was tailing off. So you still get this attitude of it should only be American. But to me, country music is it's a form of folk music in the broadest term, which is telling the story of you and where you live. And that can be in absolutely any style. It really broadens it out. And if you like just the old style stuff, that's great. Not a problem. Some of the more modern stuff, you have to say, that's really, it may be pushing the boundaries a little bit to call it country, because that just sounds like a bit of rock and roll music. It's difficult sometimes to see where the dividing line is.
Sure.
It's like, you're talking about the 70s. One of those bands I heard then and I've loved ever since, the Eagles.
Sure.
How do you define the Eagles? I mean, apart from just saying they're brilliant, how musically do you define them? When they're doing pure country, a bit of folk, some rock and roll, a mixture of all.
Right.
And so I think the best thing to do is don't try and define country, because I think it's impossible. I think that the quote was a guy, Harlan Howard, big country artist, who said, country music is 3 chords and the truth. There you go.
It's that simple, huh?
And I think that's the best way. Don't try and define it, because whatever country music is to you, that's country music.
So let me see if I understand something here before we get to the Beatles part of our conversation here. But it seems like this is an odd twist. In the United States, there were a lot of Black artists in the 50s who struggled to get airplay.
Yeah.
And let's face it, they did have some success. Chuck Berry had hits on the pop charts. Fats Domino had hits on the pop charts.
Yeah.
But the British people absorbed all this stuff so well, and the Beatles covered these artists. The Rolling Stones covered these artists, the Animals, then they recorded that music and we ate it up.
Yeah.
So a lot of the stations that at first wouldn't play the Black artists, now we're discovering Chuck Berry and Fats Domino and the white, artists of the 50s too, through the British. It seems to be the reverse when it comes to country music. That it went from, England, became popular in the US, and then became popular again in your country. But then, like you said, you can't fully define country music.
No, you can't. And it's interesting because I used that same analogy of what was going on with some of those Black artists in the 50s. When you think of like Little Richard bringing out something like Tutti Frutti.
Right.
And then getting it sanitized, re-recorded, and Pat Boone then has a hit with it.
Yep.
So making it safe and white. Whereas over here, it's color made absolutely no difference. And particularly, and I think it's one of those key things about with Liverpool, because we've been such a multicultural, cosmopolitan port city for so long. We were used to growing up with people of so many different nationalities, different skin colors, whatever, and I've been able to get on. We didn't see color. I grew up in one of the most multicultural, multiracial areas of Liverpool, in Toxteth. I had friends who were Black. To me, I had friends. The color of the skin meant absolutely nothing to me. It made no difference. So when, like, John Lennon was discovering Little Richard, it was because he heard Long Tall Sally, and thought, that is great. He didn't care what the color of that guy's skin was. The music was great, and that's what it was. The music was the most important. But the strange thing came is when American country music killed British country music temporarily. And it's my fun chapter in there, which is called Achy Breaky Hearty Breaky, which is when country music had a big following in all the major cities, and then Billy Ray Cyrus comes out with Achy Breaky Heart. Massive hit. Yeah. Everybody wants to do line dancing. And then suddenly, across Britain, people are going to dance halls dressed in cowboy gear. And all they want is songs you can line dance to. And what this meant was the promoters were not prepared to pay for a full band. All they want is somebody with a backing tape who could lead the singing and do a bit of calling and making sure people could line dance to it. And it absolutely, it killed live country music in this country. And it's taken a long time to get back. to where that was. So I'm passing some of that blame onto you on behalf of.
I don't know Billy Ray Cyrus personally, but
Oh, that's your disclaimer. You're just saying that. But that's what happens when you get a really good song. It's a brilliant song, so catchy. But it started this line dancing craze over here, and you'll still find places now who still do a lot of line dancing. And that was what, mid-80s when that came out. But it killed dead a lot of British country bands.
You could say that certain periods in music history. I know that, and I'm a big fan of disco. Not to the point where I went to discos, but once the disco craze hit, a lot of bands were passed over because they were expected to put out dance records at the time. And sometimes a lot of the disco records were just a backing tape with the beat instead of having musicians. Not saying all, there are plenty of musicians that still played on disco records, but yet it did affect the industry to some degree. And musicians at the time. And one of the great things about this era that we're talking about, discovering Little Richard, you just had a record. In some cases, you didn't have a picture of the person. You didn't know what they looked like.
No.
Pre-MTV, pre-videos, all you had was the audio. And so it didn't really matter what the person looked like. And you didn't judge.
Exactly. No, because a lot of people thought Elvis was black when he started because of that great voice and the style of the music he was doing, which again, Elvis has got very, very strong country roots. The hillbilly cat, when he started out, and for someone like John Lennon, Elvis was God. He was the man. And then when Michael Hill brings him Long Tall Sally and says, here's somebody I think's better than Elvis. Now, if John didn't know you, he would probably punch you at that point. Nobody insulted Elvis. But he said when he listened to Long Tall Sally, he said, I couldn't speak. It was that great. And because the music they were listening to, they were only listening to, they weren't getting magazines or anything like that. They were tuning into Radio Luxembourg, tuning into Armed Forces Network, which is broadcasting to the American troops still in Europe.
Right.
They were tuning in on shortwave radio late at night. All that mattered was listening. That's what got them, was hearing the music. I mean, and that was one I know. When I've spoken to people like the Quarrymen and guys over the years, and Rock Around the Clock comes out and becomes the big thing, and it's in the movie cinemas and everything. And he thought, oh, this was great. And of course, that song is straight off of Hank Williams' Move It On Over song. The melody and everything's exactly the same as that from the late 40s. But you get Rock Around the Clock, the timing's right. They go and see the film, they listen to it, and then he actually comes over to appear in the UK, and there's pictures of this guy, slightly rotund, his kiss curl. Well, he's about 30-ish by then, and I think the phrase is, well, he just looked like your boring old uncle. He wasn't somebody you could get excited about, and that then became the turn-off. Whereas when they start seeing the pictures of Elvis, no, he just looked so good. He had everything to go with it. So they discovered what he sounded like, and then what he looked like. Thought, yeah, he's good. So yeah, with Bill Haley, that was a bit of a put off, but for anybody else, it just made them more excited.
And actually, and I put this in my radio show, Every Little Thing, but 20 Flight Rock was really, Rock Around the Clock. It's a very similar idea if you think about it.
Yeah. But it's like, again, I think I was talking with Rod Davis from the Quarrymen. Oh, it's when we interviewed him for Looking for Lennon. And he says, Lonnie Donegan comes along with Rock Island Line, which is pure, American folk country song, completely. He said, and you learn those 3 chords. And realize, well, for most skiffle songs, it's 3 chords. But those 3 chords play the country songs. Then the same 3 chords play the rock and roll.
Right.
So there was very little chances where a group would say, right, we're just doing that and not that. So, for example, when you look at that early Quarrymen business card, which says country, western, skiffle, rock and roll, they were doing a bit of everything. And when I was talking with Phil Brady, and I was saying, you're there in the 60s alongside the Mersey beat groups. what were you playing that was different? And he said, well, you'd have a bill and there'd be like 6 or 7 groups playing that night. And there's so many crossovers with the songs they were playing.
Right.
So some of what you'd be doing would be pure country. Nobody else would touch them. But you could be doing Hank Williams, which really fits in nicely with both.
Mm-hmm.
But still, as a country group, you'd still be playing Chuck Berry. Because that's not a problem. You can easily do that in that country style.
Mm-hmm.
So you'd have nominally Mersey beat group and country group appearing in the same evening on stage and having crossovers of the same styles of music. It wasn't a clash. It wasn't a problem. It gave you a bit more variety.
But when you get down to it, rock and roll is really, it's like an amalgamation of all these different genres of music anyway. So it should fit.
Yeah. So it's again, those same chords. You could play whatever you wanted. And one of the guys, talk about Kenny Johnson, he was in a Mersey beat group called Sonny Webb and the Cascades. Now, his heart was in country, but he was playing the rock and roll stuff as well.
Mm-hmm.
The Mersey beat craze hits. So around sort of 63, he's thinking, everybody's now trying to be the Beatles or Jerry and the Pacemakers or the Searchers. Do we want to be just another one of those?
Mm-hmm.
No, our heart's in country. So that's it. They stopped being Sonny Webb and the Cascades. They became the Hillsiders, and they did country. But their style of country was closer to Carl Perkins and country rock than it was to maybe what Phil Brady was doing, which would be more Hank Williams and Hank Snow and Slim Whitman, etc.
And the Hillsiders became like the biggest band of country music, right, in England?
Yep. So at different stages, Phil Brady and the Ranchers were number one. Hillsiders were number one, and they had more success than anyone as well. They had a number of albums. They went over to Nashville, stayed out there for quite a while, recorded over there, did an album with Bobby Bare, who was a huge country star out there at the time. They did some residency out there, and they did have the opportunity to stay out there for a lot longer. They decided not to, and I know it's something they did regret. But they ended up, we had a TV series for George Hamilton IV did over in Britain. And the Hillsiders were the band who played with him on the TV shows. So they had a lot of success. So again, mainstream television, we had country music there. And say, you know, when I was growing up in the 70s, all those years ago.
Yeah. You know, there's a quote from you, I believe, in the book. There is no doubt that without Lonnie Donegan, John, Paul, and George would not have formed a group. The same goes for Liverpool groups and numerous British groups who became famous. But to play devil's advocate, since you just said that all these bands were playing a variety of things, Skiffle only lasted a year. So don't you think that?
No, Skiffle lasted about 2.5 years. Rock Island Line came out at the beginning of 56.
Okay.
It was definitely, it built up to 56. 57 was really big. 58, for most of 58, it was pretty big, was starting to tail off and was virtually gone by the end of 58, early 59.
Okay.
What it did was it took people like John and the Quarrymen from loving listening to music, which is their favorite pastime, to being shown, actually, you can do this. Because at that point, if you wanted a career in music, you had to go to a music school. You had to learn notation and music theory, and learn a proper instrument. A guitar was not a proper instrument back then. Now, there was not many around. A proper instrument was, you know, one of the strings. You know, so you could do at school. You know, violin practice. You know, we all started with a hideous thing called the recorder, horrible instrument, which is only replaced by a more hideous one, the violin. It's great when it's played properly, but listening to somebody learn to play violin is terrible. So you could learn proper musical instruments, but really only the people that bought guitars were probably learning classical guitar, or was the odd person saying, I think I can try and learn some of that country music, which was easy enough to pick up. What Lonnie Donegan did was he changed that. So from selling some, like, I think 5,000 guitars in the UK in the early 50s per year, within 12 months of Rock Island Line, they were selling over 200,000 guitars. And what that meant was that, because Donegan was saying, this music's dead simple. You don't need to learn to read and write music. Learn these chords, learn these songs. So they pick them up, they learn them, they form groups. You got your guitar, stuff you can find in the house, washboard, make your own T-chest bass.
Right.
Wooden packing case, broom handle, bit of string. There's your upright bass. Now, the Quarrymen were unusual because they actually had a drummer in Colin Hanson. Not many skiffle groups had drums. And they were thrown together, and 3 or 4 chords, you just played everything in those chords that you knew. What it did was it got young people forming music groups and realizing this is fun, we can do this. And then coming back to that point earlier, which was, well, once you've learnt those 3 or 4 chords for skiffle, you realize that really is country music. And then when rock and roll comes in, well, the roots the same. They could then progress. So that was the difference. It was, nobody was buying guitars. Nobody thought of music as a career unless you could do all the music theory, etc. That's what Lonnie Donegan changed. And in this country, you look at the major bands that came in the 60s, skiffle's at the root of them.
It's interesting because usually whenever I hear the Beatles story being told, they usually say skiffle lasted a year. It was very quick and it faded. But going back to Michael Hill, who for our viewers, they may not know the name, but he was a childhood friend of John's, and John and Pete Shotton and was it Don Beatty?
Don Beatty, yeah.
Yeah, they all went to Michael's house and listened to his record collection. And I interviewed Michael through your help. Thank you, David. He put out a book, which we'll talk about at the end of our conversation here. But according to Michael, it wasn't until John heard Long Tall Sally that he wanted to make a career out of this. So that was after skiffle, right?
No, it's everything happened all at the same time in early 56. Rock Island Line, Long Tall Sally, Heartbreak Hotel, all within a matter of months.
Right.
That's what that was there. So I think when Michael came back from his trip to Amsterdam with this record, that was around April, I think, of 56.
Right.
So Rock Island Line had just come out and become a massive hit. You got Elvis with his Heartbreak Hotel, got Long Tall Sally. So it was unattainable still at that point. But John was saying the big thing for him was, he starts his group and they're playing the skiffle songs, but he wants to be Elvis. He wants to do rock and roll, but his skiffle group couldn't do it. So then on the 6th of July, 1957, when Paul McCartney turns up, Paul plays 20 Flight Rock, we just mentioned, goes to the piano and plays a bit of Long Tall Sally. Now, this is one of those things which a lot of people don't realize, and I pointed out to Michael when I was helping him publish the book. Long Tall Sally defines the Beatles' career. It's the song that John says when he looked back, that's what took him out of Liverpool. It's one of the songs that Paul played to him when they met at that audition. When they come back from Hamburg for the first time at the end of 1960, they go to Litherland Town Hall, which is considered the birth of Beatlemania and starts their rock career in Liverpool. The first song they play is Long Tall Sally. When they come over to America, Long Tall Sally is what they're playing. And correct me if I'm wrong, but Candlestick Park, final concert.
Right. They switched it. Yeah. It was I'm Down, but then they switched it to Long Tall Sally.
See, it defines the Beatles' career. So that's when John was saying that was the song. That's why it changed it for him. But at that stage of hearing it, he didn't realize he could have a career. in music. He just loved that music. But because he gets Skiffle started and he gets the Quarrymen going, Paul comes in, who has this amazing vocal range
Hmm.
and can sing like Little Richard, which John couldn't.
Right.
The possibility for John was, if he can do that, we could make something of this. And then as they progress and they become a rock and roll band, as John said, if you didn't see and hear the Beatles in the black leathers in Liverpool or Hamburg, you never saw the real Beatles.
Mm.
He was a rock and roller at heart. When they were busting the stages over in Hamburg, when they were hitting all the clubs over here in Liverpool,
Yeah.
free of all the other constraints, that's when he saw them at their best. And everybody I've ever spoken to who saw them at that time, I remember talking with Sam Leach, Beatles promoter, and he promotes them a hell of a lot, particularly in 1961. And he said the difference was staggering. When they got back from Hamburg in 61, they were pure rock and roll. So never seen anybody like them. So they were just electric. They were amazing.
It's interesting because that July 6th, that first encounter, supposedly the first encounter between John and Paul, Paul always talks about 20 Flat Rock.
Yeah.
And the fact that he remembered all the words and that impressed John, and
which he did,
and that he could tune his guitar and that impressed John. He doesn't really talk about Long Tall Sally.
No, I think maybe it was of more importance to John, because John had mentioned it in interview. That and so for Paul, the most important thing was showing that he could play the guitar and do 20 Flat Rock. Again, not knowing that John had heard that song and absolutely loved it as well.
Right.
So they connected over that song. But doing that little bit of Long Tall Sally, Paul would not have realized the importance of doing that. But there was a great importance to John, because that was the song. He kept going back to him saying that was the one.
So talk about the biggest country influences on the Beatles. Obviously, Carl Perkins is there. Everyone would probably think of Carl first. But beyond that, I mean, I guess you have to go through every rockabilly artist of the 50s. And, Elvis, obviously, Buddy Holly, all those people. Talk about some of them and what they meant to the Beatles. Obviously, we know that they covered their music, but and how did that also influence their songwriting?
I think that the biggest one probably would be Buddy Holly. And from all the Merseybeat musicians I've talked to over the years, that moment of Buddy Holly coming to Liverpool, playing the Philharmonic Hall, 20th of March, 1958, that was the game changer. Now, it was huge for John, because he was this guy who looked the complete opposite to Elvis. Elvis was the pin-up guy.
Right.
Buddy Holly wasn't. He looked a bit awkward. He had those, his dark rimmed glasses on, which of course John had but wouldn't wear until he saw Buddy Holly wearing them. The new idea of, here's a simple setup for a group, guitars and drums. And I was always curious to think, if he was in Liverpool, why didn't any of the Beatles go to see him? And I found out John actually did go and see Buddy Holly. And I don't know why he picked it up in interviews. Maybe he wasn't asked, I don't know. But I found out because he was hanging out with Nigel Wally. Now, Nigel sometimes played T-chess bass with Quarrymen, but he became the Quarrymen's manager.
Right.
And so he did the business cards and everything. He got them bookings, he got them into the cavern, stuff like that. But I was talking to Nigel, and he said, oh, the two of them went. And he said, it was just such an amazing night. He said that, there was our hero up there on the stage in Liverpool. And that gave John the confidence to wear his glasses. But I think that was the game changer for a lot of the Liverpool musicians. So very, very quickly, you've gone from Rock Island Line being the 56, March 58, Buddy Holly's in town. Everything was changing. The groups, and probably the perfect one to follow isn't necessarily the Beatles, but Rory Storm and the Hurricanes, of starting out as a skiffle group and becoming the first professional group in Liverpool. getting the summer season off at Butlins. They were doing stuff way before the Beatles were doing it.
Yeah.
And of course, they played when Gene Vincent came to town in May '60. And at that point, the Beatles weren't even a group. That spurred them into becoming a rock and roll group. But they weren't a group at the time. It was John, Paul, George and Stuart. And they were watching Liverpool groups and Gene Vincent on stage. That's what's, that changed it.
To me, Buddy Holly's influence goes far beyond the country roots and all, because, at least the way I interpret this, Buddy Holly was more a self-contained person. He not only played guitar, he wrote his songs, he had his own band, and he even went and had a solo career.
Yeah.
And he even started producing towards the end. So he was like, a guy who did everything. And I think that impressed the Beatles.
Oh, absolutely right. And I think John could look at Elvis and admire him and want to be like him. But I'd say Buddy Holly was more of a role model of somebody he could become. Instead, wow, this guy writes his own songs. They've got that brilliant group with the Crickets, and he can be great. And of course, the first star they'd look to, who was writing their own songs and becoming big, was another Liverpool artist, Billy Fury. Because Billy Fury, Ronnie Wycherley, again, lad from the Dingle, his first album, The Sound of Fury, is now recognised as Britain's first true rock and roll album. He wrote every song on that. So when, just after the Gene Vincent gig, the Silver Beatles, as they became, did the audition at Alan Williams Wyvern Club with Johnny Hutch and Tommy Moore as drummers. That was an audition to be Billy Fury's backing group. Billy Fury was the big star. They knew who he was. They knew he wrote his own songs. They knew he was from Liverpool.
Right.
It was somebody else they could connect with. And, John went over and got his autograph and referred to him as Mr. Fury. Excuse me, Mr. Fury, can I have your autograph? So they had somebody locally they could look to as well.
Right.
So it's all these different reasons. You put all those together in this short space of time.
What I had just said about Buddy Holly, I'm wondering what the difference is between someone like him and a Chuck Berry. Chuck Berry wrote his material, most of it. Fats Domino wrote quite a lot of his own material.
Yeah.
What was the difference as far as influence? Because the Beatles are influenced by all of them.
I think that is the main thing. It's like defining country music. You can't get stuck with saying that was the influence. It is so broad, and that's why we're doing this book just on the country influences.
Right.
This doesn't say everything they did was country, because it's not.
Sure.
Because they were soaking in so many different styles of music, and it's one of those, a perfect storm. Everything was happening at that time. So you've got radio, which could bring all this music over from America, even if you couldn't always see the artists. So you could hear that. You've got teenagers being a thing for the first time in British culture. Now, usually it was you worked till you were 14 or 15, left school, went to work, dressed like your dad. Suddenly, you've got these kids in their teens having some disposable income, being able to buy records and dress differently. Then you've got all this new music coming in. And yet some of it was coming in from the Liverpool Sailors, the Cunard Yanks. They were bringing back jazz, lots of country, but they were bringing early rock and roll, R&B, jazz, you name it.
Right.
They were bringing that music back in, and they were absorbing absolutely everything and picking out the bits they liked. And so you can't narrow it down to it's just this. It's just that the country one, until I started digging deeper, I hadn't realized how big the influence was. It's almost like being common knowledge with Beatles fans that Ringo was a huge country fan. But then when you start digging and think, well, John was a massive Hank Williams fan. And Michael Hill, we've just been talking about. No, he had some pocket money. He was buying records. John very, very rarely bought any records.
Mm-hmm.
So he would go around to Michael's house, they'd listen to him, and John would borrow. And there's about half a dozen or so Hank Williams records that Michael owned that John borrowed and listened to. So Hank became a big influence on John. So
sometimes when you think about the fact that John really didn't have many records, it makes you're starving for this material. So I think that it made them even far more interested and so absorbed in it all.
Absolutely. And quite often it's that thing when you're younger. If it's been put just slightly out of reach, it's even more intriguing. So they would go to a record store, and there were loads of record stores all over Liverpool. And you've seen with the hoods, so you'd ask for a record to be put on, you go and stand in the hood for a bit. And what they used to do, if they didn't have the money to buy it, which is why sometimes the Quarrymen, when they were performing songs like Come Go With Me, they didn't get the lyrics right. They were getting lyrics by scrubbing them down, listening to either to Radio Luxembourg or in the record store, in the hood, listening to it and writing stuff down until they got caught and thrown out. Or John would, the good young chap that he was, and a serial kleptomaniac, when there was the assistant's gaze was diverted, would steal a few records as well. But it was all about listening to as much of this, which was anti-establishment. Parents did not approve. Nobody approved. Therefore, it's even more exciting.
Right.
Now, to be listening late at night when you should be asleep, you should be doing homework, you're tuning into a radio. And it's just more and more exciting. And all this new music's coming in, which was so different to the music you were hearing in the house. Because in the house, you'd be listening to the radiogram with the records that be owned by your parents. Now, if you're somebody lucky like George Harrison, whose parents liked people like Slim Whitman, Hank Williams, you're okay with listening to that. But the majority of that generation of lads, their parents were listening to jazz, but also a bit of variety, music hall, which is why some of that comes through in Paul McCartney's writing.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's what his dad played and listened to. So if that's the music your parents are listening to, you think, yawn, you don't want to associate with your parents. It's a standard thing. Then suddenly there's this rebellious music from the foreign shores of America. And, and American culture was everywhere, particularly in Liverpool. So they're sort of obsessed with that. You're hearing all this amazing music, which you can relate to. I mean, who wouldn't want to do that? But going back to what we were saying before with Lonnie Donegan, until Skiffle, there was no chance of anybody thinking they could have a career as a musician in a group.
Yeah. And in some ways, I think it made it even more attractive that this music came from America. It's kind of a mystical thing from another country. But
and it's one that Liverpool has so many connections with. There's so many connections going back to the ships. The first transatlantic stuff going back in the 1840s. Liverpool to New York. So there was American culture in Liverpool, and Liverpool had more in common with New York and the US than it did with south of England.
Yeah.
So it was exciting.
What interests me perhaps the most in discussing all this is not just that the Beatles covered songs that were country-esque, like the Carl Perkins stuff, or a song like Act Naturally, but how they infuse that into their own original songs.
Absolutely.
And certainly, as we've talked about before, Beatles for Sale is like the country and western album. But when you're using the rockabilly, the lead guitar work of George in a song like I'm a Loser, or certainly I Don't Want to Spoil the Party,
absolutely,
you can hear it right there. But what I want to do is pick your brain here, because you have a chapter here in the book where you compiled your own Beatles songs that you believe have a country influence. And in some of it I can hear it, and some of it I can't. So I just want to try to hear what you're hearing in your ears,
Okay.
because I also said in my other show that when I grew up hearing songs like "Can't Buy Me Love," to me that's pure rock and roll. I'm not thinking country and western, but there is a swing to it,
Absolutely.
which I never thought about before.
Yeah.
And when it's presented in this context, you can say to yourself, "Yeah, I can see that." But in particular, a song like "You Like Me Too Much." I
Yeah.
mean, you think that has a country and western vibe
Yeah.
to it.
Yeah. Well,
What do you hear exactly?
not necessarily country and western, and that's one of the important things. Because country and western and country are different. Because western, I'd always assume was to do with cowboy films, which was
Hmm.
the thing. But the western in country and western is western swing, which is the jazz influence in country music. So that's what the country and western bit is. So you're picking up a different style of country music, but I think that one has a little bit of blues in it as well, and it's one of
Hmm.
those crossover ones where it depends what you're listening for. And this was the hardest thing for me, and why I started from scratch, and I listened to every album, starting to please me, and working my way through,
Hmm.
as well as reading other people's opinions. But I wanted it to be more my opinion of what I thought I was hearing,
Right.
and how I could pick that up and think, well, is that so? Some of them, like, I've Just Seen a Face.
Hmm.
You can go, oh yeah, that's fair enough. Not many people will argue with that. That's a mixture of skiffle, bluegrass, etc. Nice and clear.
Right.
Um, but I think with a lot, particularly of the George Harrison songs, the thing was, if you take into account the guitar he was playing for quite a bit of that recording career, the two of them, the Gretsch guitars, the Tennessee and the Country Gentleman,
Hmm.
are country guitars,
Sure.
Chet Atkins style. He'd learned to play like Chet Atkins when he was at school. So that sort of sound comes through a lot of songs. And so you could pick a hell of a long list just because of that's the style that George
Hmm.
defined. But I think of something like You Like Me Too Much. It's got that nice simplicity to it, which a lot of country music has. It's not complicated, and it just picks up. I think one thing that helped was listening to I listened to a lot of the Jimmy Rogers stuff, but a lot of Hank Williams.
Hmm.
I think that helped a lot, because I think people just associate and think, well, Hank Williams is, he was doing his country and western and stuff.
Yeah.
But when you're listening to what he does, you can understand why John got particularly switched on, because you can hear the roots of rock and roll in there. And that influence is what I suddenly realized I was hearing. It was that part of country music.
Hmm.
And again, you look at Hank Williams, and there's a lot of blues in there, a lot of what became rock and roll, as well as older traditional style country
Right.
as well. So you've got this multitude of genres within it. And I just thought, when I was listening to that, and I would listen to the songs over and over and think, have I heard that? Have I not? Go back and listen to it again. Leave it. Go back to it again. And I
Hmm.
went over the list a number of times just to listen. And it was nice that I put it into a playlist.
Hmm.
Again, this is the beauty of modern music, isn't it? You don't have to put one record on, take that off, put the next one. You
Right.
get them digitally, you put them in a playlist. And that became my Beatles country album. And when you put them all together, you think, that all works. None of them stand out, as that doesn't fit in there. And that then became what I was listening to,
Yeah.
was my Beatles country album, which has got like
So
20
in
something
so,
songs on.
in some cases, it's more the sound of George's guitar than maybe the arrangement of the song.
Um, a little bit, but it would be more if there was something in the guitar solo he was doing,
Hmm.
which maybe sounds a bit more slide guitar then. If it was just the way he was like picking it in the back, I wouldn't just select those, because that really could make your list huge. But it's one that I would feel had, well, it's like it sat on a country album
Hmm.
that I put my playlist together and thought, yeah, that works as a country album.
Right.
If I'd come across a song, I thought, nah, that doesn't actually work. Therefore, I'd take it out. And this was the list that I ended up with. I thought, yeah, they sound country to me. And that's only because I'd listened to so much country music
Hmm.
with all the people who were influencing, the Hillsides and Phil Brady and Hank Walters, and saying, no, who were you listening to? I went then and listened to them.
Mm-hmm.
I thought, okay, can I then hear what the music they were listening to at that time? Because the danger is, I've had this argument with people over drumming, and we've debated this before with Pete Best and Ringo, and somebody arguing saying, I listened to Pete Best on the Decca recordings. He sounds nothing like Ringo does on Rain. Yeah, there's quite a few years in between that.
Yeah.
Okay, you can only judge anything that's contemporaneous, and so I would listen to what music were the Beatles and that generation listening to
Mm-hmm.
up until that point. Forget everything else that came after the more modern country that we've talked about.
Right.
Who were they listening to? Can I hear that influence in the songs that they were writing? So that's what I was listening for.
Mm.
I'm thinking, yeah, that fits. That makes sense to me as a country song.
Mm.
But
Well, that's why I like having discussions like these, because the music that you listen to outside of the Beatles and their solo music can influence how you hear the Beatles.
oh, you're
So
absolutely right. Yeah,
yeah,
and
and
it's what you're listening for.
right.
For when I was doing Finding the Fourth Beatle and covering all these drummers,
Mm.
I listened to all the Beatles records just listening for the drumming,
Mm-hmm.
which I'd never done before. And the stuff you hear, which is why I'll go into an argument with anybody over the quality of Ringo Starr and his
Mm-hmm.
drumming.
Right.
When you're listening for what he was doing, you think, I'd never heard that before. That is, and every time he does it, it's perfect for the song.
Mm-hmm.
And so you put your country headset on and you go, right, I'm thinking country influences, and you listen and you hear stuff you'd never heard before.
Mm-hmm.
Now you could do the same with R&B. You can do stuff just trying to think, I'm going to listen for Paul McCartney's bass line. And every now and again think, oh, that is brilliant. That is
Mm-hmm.
absolutely brilliant. I hadn't heard it in that detail before.
Right.
So stick your right mindset on that. I think you're completely right. Is what are you listening for? And you will always find it somewhere in the Beatles
Mm.
song collection, which is phenomenal.
But going back to You Like Me Too Much, I was just wondering, because you've got that rolling piano
Yeah,
sound, which to me is a little honky tonk ish,
yeah,
you
which is
know?
country.
Yeah. So I'm thinking maybe that's why you all this
Yeah,
time thought You Like Me Too Much. Same thing with Rocky Raccoon. It's got the same piano type of
yeah,
playing on it.
yeah, very, very much so. And
Yeah.
that's it. And it's picking up for different sounds
Mm-hmm.
that they were doing at the time, which it's not necessarily just the ones like you say George was picking in his own style he would do
Mm.
on his Gretsch, but it's saying they specifically gone and added an instrument or the sound of an instrument that you would associate with a particular genre.
Yeah.
So as you say, you suddenly hear honky tonk piano, you're thinking, okay, that isn't by chance. They've done that deliberately.
Mm.
So yeah, no, I completely agree with you.
Yeah. Just gonna pick one more song. I could mention many here that you have on your list, but with a little help from my friends, you
Yeah.
hear country in that?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, if you go for good old country, because a lot of the stuff you get to like the country waltz type style, and you just listen to the way the drums are done with the way the bass line is.
Mm.
It's just got that lilt to it, which is probably one of those that goes back to some of the earliest styles of country music. When we're going back to those 30s and 40s style, nice
Right.
and simple, nice song structure. But
Okay.
quite often I'm listening to the style that Paul plays on the bass, because that often is the giveaway. You got that nice boom, boom, and you just think, yeah, I can. You can just see that nice country shuffle, country waltz
Mm.
wandering around. Yeah, fits in very,
Okay.
very easily.
You had on your list, and I wanted to bring up this song, One After 909, and I think that is a very important song to bring up because you go back to the skiffle days and they had a lot of, train songs.
Yeah, yeah,
you know,
exactly.
Freight Train and Cumberland Gap and all that. And I
Rock
remember
Island Line.
reading Rock Island Line, yes.
Yeah.
Paul said in many years from now that he and John wrote One After 909 to write a railroad song or a train song.
Yeah.
So I could hear One After 909 as a skiffle song.
Oh
And
yeah, absolutely.
even though the 1963 version is very different from the one on Let It Be, I could still hear an earlier version of One After 909.
Yeah, to me, I absolutely love that song.
Mm-hmm.
I love the simplicity of it and the fact. Yeah, it definitely reminds me of skiffle. Fits in there, and when they do it as a straight rock song, and I was just disappointed they never finally polished that off as a good rock song as well. But then it's got a real country feel to it on Let It Be.
I think it comes across as pretty
And that
polished on Let It Be.
Before, which was
What's that?
well, no, I agree.
Okay.
But it's one of those we were saying before. You've got those three chords.
Mm-hmm.
One After 909 is a skiffle and country and rock and roll song because it fits all three of those.
Mm-hmm.
It's it's one of my favorite songs. I love it. Absolutely love that song.
Yeah. I'm just surprised that they let it sit for so many years when
Exactly.
they really could have put it on all their albums.
Yeah, particularly when you're looking at Please Please Me.
Yeah.
I think that would have fit very, very nicely on there. I really do.
Well, they tried to do it in '63 during From Me to You, the sessions for that, so it's close in time.
Yeah, yeah. No, it's a great song, and yeah, I would have liked to have heard them finish it off earlier on as well, because it's always been one of my favorites, that one.
And if they tried it each year, it could have sounded different each year in the arrangement.
Yeah, and they could have made it so. Yeah.
I would like to talk just briefly on some of the solo recordings that show a country influence. Obviously, you got to talk about Beaucoups of Blues and your thoughts about that album.
Do you know what? I absolutely love that album. And it's one of those that I'd heard, but I'd not listened to for so long. And I went back to it when I was working on this project. No, and I'd had it on the LP. That's how long ago. And I thought, no, I've grabbed the CD. So I got it and I put it in the car, which is when I do most of my, listening on loud when I'm on my own driving. And I love just driving and listening to music. And I put that on and thought, this is just a great country album. Ringo's vocal, brilliant, absolutely perfectly suited. And the quality of the songs on there, that sits alongside, some big country artists. That fits in very, very nicely indeed. I think it's a really, really good album. I love listening to that. So I'm glad through doing this project, I found that one again, because it's one I'd completely forgotten about and not listened to in so long. And I put that back on and thought, oh yeah, this is a great country album. And it's nice that it was put together quickly.
2 days.
Exactly. It's that old style, like with Please Please Me. They love that pressure of let's get in the studio. Springsteen's just done it, hasn't he, with his most recent album? He sent it with the E Street Band. He said, right, here's a little bit of information, get to the studio. Then he plays them the song. Then they work on an arrangement. And they did the whole album in like 2 weeks. Because that's how they used to do it. And they said that pressure of the time, it made them concentrate. And I love the fact that, Ringo wants to go to the home of country music. And of course, he's performed in Nashville a few times. And go there and make what is a really, really good country album. And I think probably gets lost in the Beatles solo works. Well, I think it's great. I love it.
That album has gained in stature over the years when people talk about the best of Ringo, because they know how suitable his voice is for country. It really fits extremely well. And so many of those songs, I don't know why they weren't hits on the country charts. But,
absolutely.
Something that I wanted to tell you, I'm not sure if you're aware of this, but many years ago when I interviewed Ken Mansfield,
Oh yeah.
who is, for those of you that don't know, he was the US manager for Apple Records. And one of the jobs that he had in the 70s was to mail country albums to Ringo. Ringo would ask him, and
Yeah.
he loved the Outlaws. He loved
Oh yeah.
Waylon Jennings and Willie Nelson and those people. So it just goes to show you how much Ringo loved the music because he asked Ken
Yeah.
to mail him albums back in
Yeah.
the old days of mailing,
And of
and
albums coming in the post.
yes, vinyl albums. But yeah, and it's really shocking to me because he's been asked this many times, why doesn't he make another country album? And he thinks about it, but he just falls into this rut of I got to make the next pop album,
Yeah.
or whoever who he's working with at the time, it falls into being a pop album. But I think
Yeah.
a lot of people, especially in the country field, I asked Ken, were there people in country music that really were aware of this? And he said, absolutely. It
Yeah.
was generating a lot of buzz at the time. And yeah, I wish he'd do more of it. And he sprinkles it every now and then on his solo albums.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. Because you can tell that's where his heart lies.
Mm,
He grew up listening to these American country artists. And that comes through in his drumming. But yeah, when he put together that album, I'm glad it's getting popularity again because it deserves it. I think it's a really, really good.
mm,
Even if you ignore the fact this is Ringo Starr of the Beatles, just this is a great
right.
country album. It stands on its own merit as a
Hmm.
great, great album. So
Yeah.
I'm glad you mentioned
It
that.
also, and this is without any remastering done. It
Yes.
sounds great,
Oh yeah. Absolutely.
production wise on that album. You listen to the CD, I can only imagine how much better it will sound if it does get remastered, but it was a well produced album too.
Yeah. And again, it's got that lovely simplicity again.
Hmm.
No, it's no complicated on 250 tracks of putting all kinds of, you know, synthesizers and all these different things in there.
Right.
Record something with instruments, nice and simple, because the song is good enough to carry it. Just go with it. And yeah,
Well,
it's great.
throughout Beatle history, we've gotten albums like that. A Run Devil
Absolutely.
Run,
Yeah.
that kind of thing.
Yeah. But you look at a lot of, how much of the Beatles recorded music was done on 4-track.
Hmm.
So, and then, wow, we've got 8 tracks. How technical was that getting towards the end of their career?
Right.
Now you can be spoiled with these huge mixing desks with so many possibilities. When you're used
Sometimes
to
that
being
makes you
good,
think even more.
yeah, yeah. But sometimes it can be such a distraction
Mm,
when you think, the music's good. If you've got the right musicians, the right environment, and the right music, do it simple. It'll carry it. And
yeah.
that is a perfect example. Really is.
Yeah. It could slow down the process,
Yeah,
the
absolutely.
advanced technology. It really shouldn't,
Oh yeah,
but it could work in reverse.
yeah,
But going
definitely.
back to Ringo, if you go to the Ringo album, Sunshine Life for Me, I mean, my God, that's like a hoedown,
Yeah,
and George Harrison wrote it.
yeah,
So, there's another song called Crying from Ringo's Rotogravure, which is an amazing country song
yeah,
that Ringo co-wrote with Vinnie Poncia.
yeah.
And he also recorded a duet with Willie Nelson,
Absolutely.
Write One for Me.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
it's been there throughout his solo career and the Beatle years. So I
And in
wish
fact,
he'd do more of
recently
it.
he's just been on Randy Crowell has just done an album called Texas,
Right.
and Ringo drummed on one of the tracks.
Hmm. Yeah.
So and that album only came out last year.
And I think it was maybe 2 years ago, Ringo covered a Roger Miller song,
Yeah,
Hey, Won't You Hold It Down? It was for a tribute to Roger Miller. So it stays with him, you
it
know?
absolutely, and it's like almost where we started off. I think is the music you discover in your formative years, particularly your teens. That is the music that will stay with you
Mm,
for the rest of your life. I think that once you find something you love in those years, you never lose that. You may sometimes forget it and come back to it, but there's some sort of comfort of as we get older
mm,
of coming back and saying, do you know what, that was my first love, I'm going to listen to that again. And maybe it's to convince us oldies that we're young again. I don't know, but that's the music that stays with you, and you never lose that.
Mm-hmm. I've said it many times, and it's something that I've recently discovered, is that, the music that you hear in your adolescence, teenage years, maybe in your 20s, that's the music that will have the greatest impact on your life.
Absolutely. Yeah, totally agree. Yeah. You can
Yeah.
go back to and define all these key moments in your life, and you know the song that goes to it. But at heart, what you were listening to in those years, that's what you'll always go back to.
Yeah. And I try to keep somewhat in touch with new music. And there's a lot of new music out there that I like,
Likewise.
but I could never say that it will have the same impact as something that I heard when I was a teenager, you know?
No, definitely. Maybe that's just because we're getting old. I don't know.
Only I am. You're staying the same, Dave.
Oh, I wish.
It's that British air. Must be that.
The rain. This is rust.
Let's mention a few other country songs from the other Beatles in their solo careers. Talk about George. Which ones come to mind for you?
Oh my goodness. Because I immediately, when I'm thinking of George and country, I immediately go to the Wilburys.
Mm.
Now, because again, if you're going to be in two groups, then being in the Beatles and the Traveling Wilburys, that's not bad at all, is it?
No.
I know. And I think that's what I loved about the Traveling Wilburys, because they're doing that mixture of sounds. You know, we were saying before, how do you define the Eagles?
Mm.
It's a bit like that with the Wilburys, I think, because you look at who's on board there. You've got the big folk influence, though, of course, Dylan did a bit country as well.
Mm.
So you got Dylan in there. You got George with his rockabilly influences in there.
Mm-hmm.
You've got Jeff Lynne, who sort of came through the same musical transition as George did,
Right.
with skiffle and moving on. And then you've got, Roy Orbison, who to me still has probably one of the greatest voices ever in music. I've always loved his music as well.
No doubt.
Put that in with Tom Petty, who's got that nice country rock. What a mixture. I mean, it's like with a lot of the Eagles stuff, it's, to me, is musical perfection.
Mm-hmm.
It is just so wonderful. And I think the fact, because at the time in their careers they were doing this for fun. They're doing it because they enjoyed it. They didn't have to do that.
Right.
They didn't have to be going out there and making money. They weren't sleeping on benches in the backs of vans traveling around the country.
Right.
They did the music they loved, and that combination, it is wonderful. And it's funny, whatever George is doing, you recognize his guitar work, don't you?
Oh yeah, he's got a signature sound,
Yeah.
no doubt about it, with his slide guitar work. Nobody
Absolutely.
sounds like him.
Yeah.
But yeah, that was one of the happiest accidents that ever happened in music history.
It's brilliant, isn't it?
A B-side for a George Harrison single, resulting in an album, which really only took a couple of weeks to make. That's it. You talk about recording quickly.
Yeah. And again, you can hear the fun they're having.
Yeah.
Doing this, and when you watch the film that they did, and they're messing around in the studio, and they're still scribbling down lyrics.
Yep.
And they're standing there around the microphone, holding up, and just, and then what?
Yeah.
But that's the skill of a brilliant musician, and that combination was just incredible.
It's a combination of talent and spontaneity there in the studio, and it's just incredible. Yeah.
I love it. So that's the perfect vehicle for mixing all those country influences together with whatever else they wanted.
Yeah. And I think, George's slide guitar work really lent itself to country music so well. And, I always think of Behind That Locked Door as a great country song. And even I Live For You, which was a bonus track on All Things Must Pass when it was reissued from those sessions, Should have been on the original album. It's that good.
Yeah.
But so many songs, even like If Not For You, even though Dylan wrote it, has a
Yeah.
country feel to it.
Yeah. Yeah. And absolutely right. And I think that's the great thing, because of the styles that George saw as influencing him, which is Carl Perkins and Chet Atkins.
Hmm.
Then there you've got, because obviously Chet Atkins then, as producer, defines the Nashville sound.
Right.
And you've got the Carl Perkins style that George had picked up, say, while still at school. Again, this is when you're putting your different ears on to listen to songs.
Mm-hmm.
And I can remember going back and just think, right, I'm going to listen to all the Beatles songs again, because I need like another excuse. This time I'm going to listen to what George is doing. And that was sparked because somebody said to me, well, really, the Beatles is only about John and Paul. They were the songwriters. If you take either of them out, you haven't got the Beatles, but not so much about the other two.
Mm-hmm.
I was thinking, what? You can't say that. And then I was thinking, I knew in my heart you couldn't say that anyway. I thought,
Mm-hmm.
but I'm going to go and listen to what George Harrison was doing. You take out George Harrison's guitar work, that destroys a lot of Beatles songs.
Mm-hmm.
Because there's some of that simple stuff of that sort of picking style that he could do behind what John and Paul were doing.
Right.
It makes the song, it's brilliant. And you cannot take that out of the mix, just like you cannot take Ringo out of the Fab Four. For his guitar work, you cannot, I don't think you could have replaced George with anybody who would have done what he did. Because that unique style.
All four Beatles are irreplaceable.
Absolutely right.
And there's a lot of people that don't realize that. It was the chemistry between the four of them, although you could always make the argument that the songwriting, so much of it were singular achievements, songs written by John, Paul, and George for the most part, and they were great songs on their own, regardless of whether the Beatles did it or not. But the Beatles recordings were special because in most cases it was the four of them. Some had less than four. But, there's always that argument between the song and the recording.
Yeah.
The Beatles songs are great songs, whether the Beatles did them or not, but the
how many artists have done a cover version of a Beatles song?
Thousands.
But how many of them are as good, if not better?
Well, that's a matter of opinion. I mean, I think the Beatles versions are better myself. I've heard arguments. Some people think Joe Cocker's version of
But that's a different arrangement, because it's a completely different song in a way.
Yeah.
So it is, and that's one of the few I think you could say, well, actually, he's taken quite a simple song and done a variation of an arrangement and come up with an absolutely brilliant version of the song. But I've listened to so many covers of Beatles songs, and they could play exactly the same music, exactly the same arrangement the Beatles did, and it will not sound as good.
I agree with you, but we're biased.
Do you think?
Yeah, just slightly, just a little bit, a touch. There are a lot of cover versions that I do like, but I tend to like it when artists do their own arrangement and don't try to copy the Beatles.
Yeah. And loads of country artists have covered Beatles songs,
which you cover in the book.
Absolutely, and that sort of makes the case of the basic structure of the song fits so easy in the country genre that so many country artists can cover them very easily and do a good job.
You mentioned one of my favorites, which is Randy Travis doing Nowhere Man.
Yeah.
Really nice.
Yeah.
And
I love Emmylou Harris's Here, There and Everywhere.
Oh, sure.
Oh,
a beautiful voice.
Absolutely. I mean, that is just gorgeous arrangement.
There's a recording of I Feel Fine, which I don't know if you know it, by Sweethearts of the Rodeo. And that was a hit on the country charts in America back in the 80s. And obviously I Feel Fine lends itself to a country arrangement.
Absolutely.
But Sweethearts of the Rodeo were kind of like a Judd's type band.
Yes. Yeah.
And really worked for them. I always loved their version. But there's plenty of good covers of Beatles songs done by country artists. Let's quickly mention John. Any solo songs come to mind that have the country influence?
Well, Probably one of the strangest ones that you talk when you talk about John is oh, it's gone. What am I talking about? Just gone
Crippled
completely.
inside.
Thank you, Crippled Inside. Exactly. And you're thinking,
I was reading your mind.
yeah, I'm glad you were. Can you turn the page over for me? Yeah, and it's one of those things where by that time in John's career, he's really dealing with some dark stuff, and yet he does this funny introduction. I'd like to welcome you here to the Dakota Country and Western Club.
That's Life Begins at 40.
Life Begins at 40.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah. But then he does with Crippled Inside, which when you get into the lyrics of that, is really it's the stuff which, you know, Mother and Plastic Ono Band stuff after the primal therapy, and he's really going into looking back at his life, and he got something which is really quite dark and tragic. And that just got this jaunty sing along, and think, and it's a complicated one, but yeah. So John sort of, I think you could even maybe say Look at the Irish as one, and
John Sinclair.
Yeah, because again, looking at one of the early chapters in the book was the influence of Irish music in country music. You know, we were saying about, I love that it's the Ulster Scots that brought a lot of that music to the Appalachians, which formed the basics of country music. But of course, there's a huge Irish population in Liverpool. And the Irish music, I mean, it's still there today. There are still Irish bands around playing. But that culture, that music was all around the city. Now, you'd have the big influence, particularly on the McCartney family, who, through Paul's mum and her Irish family, probably had the biggest influence on any of the Beatles. Of the family sing-along. You know, somebody gets on the piano, banjo, whatever else would come out, everybody would do these big sing-alongs. Very much that's come from the Irish culture. But you can see that with John, and obviously Paul and John both dipped their toes in the political thing with Look at the Irish and Give Ireland Back to the Irish.
Right.
And so you've got that crossover with John, where you've got the Irish influence and a bit of the Irish country in there, with again this sort of ironic song of Look of the Irish that he does. So you can pick that up, but I think John probably more than the other three, even though he loved Hank Williams and a lot of other country artists, he was always the rock and roller at heart. And I think that's what you hear coming through more than anything else, because that was that music he really connected with from his youth, and that's, I mean, he was open about that. You know, that's what he really, really loved, and because all of them in their solo careers could do what they loved, really. John was the rock and roller, but there's still those influences, and I think that the Hank Williams country rock and roll is the bit of country that John took, apart from Carl Perkins being in there as well.
I could hear country in a song like You Are Here, which has slide guitar work in it, and Tight As, you know, one of those songs. So yeah, I think it was definitely there in the solo music.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, and even, you know, Paul going out and spending those couple of weeks in Nashville.
Oh, sure.
And you know, and I was so fortunate that Dan Ely, who managed to get away and to stay on the farm with them, took all those photos, and he let me use them in the book, just hanging around with Paul and Linda and all the other guys while they were enjoying their time out in Nashville. And it's just it's a wonderful story, and the lovely photos as well. You know, so I was fortunate to get those. And again, Paul just soaking in Nashville, you know, and just enjoying it, and again connecting with those country roots.
Yeah,
with people, you know, like, and connecting with Chet Atkins,
Floyd Kramer.
Exactly.
Floyd,
So
yeah.
yeah.
And Sally G is it's as perfect a country song as you could write. You know.
Yeah, exactly. You know, how can you not be inspired if you've got that love of country from your childhood, and you spend a couple of weeks out in Nashville? How can you not come up with something which is out and out country?
Right.
And when you're as talented as somebody like Paul McCartney, that's not difficult.
He also had songs like Country Dreamer. I would definitely consider to be a country song. He worked with Johnny Cash and Tom T. Hall.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, for New Moon Over Jamaica. Do you consider, because sometimes, you know, when we talked in my other show, there are certain songs that you confuse folk with country and you don't really know how you classify. Like Heart of the Country. Is that a country song to you, or is that a folk song to you? You know,
The answer is yes.
it's everything, isn't it?
And that's the problem and it's what I always come back to. Anything when we're talking of music, is try not to pigeonhole everything.
Right.
And it is subjective. So the list of the songs that I've mentioned in the book are those that, I mean, a lot of people would probably agree with, but not everybody will. But that's what I'm hearing, you know. And my challenge is always, don't just sit there, read what I've written and say, okay, go and do it for yourself. Go and listen to all this music and pick out of it what you like. And if it's country, great. If it's not, it doesn't matter. Pick out the music that you connect with, call it whatever you want, and enjoy it. And this is just a different way of looking at one of the big influences on the Beatles. And, you know, particularly the whole point was, it's this huge influence on Liverpool, which not a lot of people in Liverpool know about, but and outside of Liverpool, virtually nobody knows anything about, of having the biggest country and western scene, certainly in the whole of the UK, but probably in Europe at that time, back in the 60s.
Right.
You know, we were the Nashville of the North. They had this huge thing where, and I've made a note of, I tried to get as many country artists into a list, and I think there's about 120. And, you know, the book's only been out, what, 2 months? And I'm already finding more people saying, oh, there was this group, you know, and such is still alive. So I'm already working on book 2.
Okay.
Because I want to make sure that we capture all these memories and all these artists while we still got them. Because obviously, like with the Beatles generation, we're losing so many. And it's about grabbing a slice of Liverpool music culture,
right,
while we can. So it's a privilege what I do.
It's important to know where the Beatles came from and what influenced them. And, you know, it's kind of funny how John ended up in New York City. You know,
well,
in so many ways, it's the same as Liverpool in that regard, with so many different cultures.
Yeah, but that brings us nicely on to teeing up for when my next book comes out. Because we've got a book coming out that I've done with Susan Ryan and Richard Porter.
Okay.
Which is called The Beatles' Fab Four Cities. And it's the 4 cities that define the Beatles' career: Liverpool, Hamburg, London, New York, and why they're so similar. And the thing that sparked it for me years ago was I never understood why someone like John Lennon would not want to settle back in Liverpool. Why the hell would he want to go to New York? And then I went to New York for the first time. I thought, no, I get it. I felt at home. New York is just a very, very big Liverpool. Hamburg is a German version of it. London's another version of it. 4 port cities, cosmopolitan populations,
right,
built around the river. There are so many similarities in the 4 cities, and that's why we've done this book, which should have been out last year, but obviously with COVID, it's been put back. So
yeah,
probably the summer. But that's why John felt at home in New York. It's just a big version of Liverpool.
See, I knew this all along. I knew this would be a perfect segue to go right into your book. You don't realize this. This is all a smooth. You got to make smooth transitions.
I like it. I didn't even notice the join. So.
All right. So before we go, why don't you give folks some information if they want to get in touch with you and how they can purchase the book?
Absolutely. So the website is thecountryof liverpool.com. So you can find out more about the book, contents about the artists, a bit more about Phil Brady, the Hillsides, and Hank Walters that I've mentioned. Then looking at the Beatles roots, so some of it in there as well. So you can get the book through there. So the countryofliverpool.com, or go over to beatlesbookstore.com, where that's on sale, as well as my other books there as well.
I meant to ask you, since you mentioned Phil Brady, but he released a single which mentions the Cavern and the Beatles in it. Can you tell the folks about that?
Yeah. So
I'm losing your audio.
Are you?
Yes.
Okay. Have you got me back?
Yes, you're back.
Excellent.
Okay,
there you go. I just nipped out for a moment.
Okay.
Just returned. After the Beatles had left the Cavern and Liverpool, a guy called Nigel Greenberg set up Cavern Sound Limited, which was a recording studio in the basement of the Cavern, which not many people realise. So I've interviewed Nigel for the book, and the first artist who recorded there was Phil Brady. So Phil Brady and the Ranchers, and they recorded the country song, which is An American Sailor at the Cavern. So that full story is in the book, and the story of how Nigel came to work with Ray McFall, and that they got the studio set up actually in the Cavern in Matthew Street, which not many people know about.
Yeah, and that's a very rare record, isn't it?
Absolutely. Yeah, they only did, I think, about 200. It was a charity single in Liverpool.
Okay. All right. Very nice. So before we go, I want to make mention of a couple things. If you want to catch the interview that I did with Dave on my podcast show, Things We Said Today, one of my 2 podcast shows, just go to YouTube, and it's show number 335, and it's more conversation about his new book, The Country of Liverpool. Also, if you can't get enough of Dave, and I understand that completely, I've done a number of interviews with him in the past. One of them is when he released the Fab 104 book, and that's on my website, which is at kenmichaelsradio.com, and that's on the page called More Interviews. There's a tab that you'll find right on the homepage. Just scroll down, you'll see David Bedford's name, and that's in there. And I also interviewed Michael Hill, who Dave was talking about, childhood friend of John's, who played his record collection for John and Phil, Pete Shotton, and Don Beatty. And that's where he heard Long Tall Sally. And when his book came out, which is called John Lennon, the Boy Who Became a Legend, which I highly recommend, I interviewed him as well. And that's also on my website. That's on interviews page 4. So up until my YouTube channel, everything's been on audio.
Now you get to see us. Wow.
Yeah, and you'll understand why I've always been on audio for those of you who've been wondering. But yes, I have a face for radio.
Exactly.
If any of you are interested, go to the website and check out those interviews. Dave, it is always a blast hanging out with you.
My pleasure.
And hopefully, oh, you didn't get to play anything on your banjo.
Oh, no.
Oh, next time maybe, unless you want to. Oh, he has it ready. Okay. No requests? Okay.
Yes, I have a lot requests, which is, can you play Far Away?
The Rainbow Connection? I don't know, but
That's what all the young folks are doing all the while. And as I look around me, I'm sometimes apt to smile, seeing all those young folks putting on the style.
Very good.
Tell me that's not country.
Some Lonnie Donegan for you.
There you go. Band, I should be.
And actually, Lonnie made an album in the 70s. I think it was called Putting on the Style, and Ringo played on it.
There you go.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Great guy. Yeah. And it was George who said, no Lead Belly, no Lonnie Donegan, no Lonnie Donegan, no Beatles. Good enough for George to say it.
That. Okay.
George Harrison said that.
That's
Yeah.
all the proof we need.
There you
Okay.
go. One more.
Dave, thanks so much for being here, spending this time with us. You're welcome back anytime.
Pleasure.
At the rate you're writing books, you'll probably be on, I don't know, 5-6 times a year.
That'll do me. Thanks, Ken. It's been a pleasure.
Okay. And for all of you watching, thanks for tuning in. Please subscribe to my channel, and we'll see you next time.
Bye.